Here we are at our home in Marietta, Georgia. We live in Cobb County, and today a special election is going on all around Georgia. Polls are about to close for the 2 Senate seats for Georgia. Today, we're going to talk about political processes. I'm Mr. Coulter, and this is Human Geography. As we continue our focus on political geography, today we're going to move to 4.2, which is political processes. And political processes all start with the ability to make laws. So legally, when you have the ability to make laws within your own country, that is known as sovereignty. So sovereignty is having the last say over a territory legally. So I've always used the example. If a group of freshmen took over one of the halls of our school, let's say the social studies hallway, and controlled our classrooms, they, although they could currently control it, could not really make their own laws or impart any sort of real change before they were stopped by like the police or something. Sovereignty, though, is having the ability to make laws. So those freshmen taking over part of the school would not have sovereignty. Sovereignty is controlling a territory and being able to make your own rules and govern it. And when you're able to control those borders, that's known as territorial integrity. So territorial integrity is when a government has the right to keep their borders and the territory of a state intact and free from attack. So when you can defend your borders from other countries and have the right to govern within that country, that is known as territorial integrity. So the right to rule and making laws is sovereignty, and then the control of those borders within is territorial integrity. So we're going to get into some of the political processes over time, like colonialism and independence movements. Colonialism, imperialism, independence movements, and devolution along national lines have influenced the contemporary boundaries of the world. So when we look at the world's boundaries, there are all these different influences that have happened through history that have led us to what those are now. For example, on the right, we have a picture of a political cartoon, which was from England during the time of imperialism. So this is the Great British government as an octopus, like pictured, because it has its tentacles out on all of these different colonies. And if you look closely, you can see they have Egypt, India, Canada right there with others around, but it's showing the wide grasp of the colonial movement of Great Britain. So as we look at these independently, so colonialism was a time period when empires took over other territory and ruled it as their own. So colonialism is the physical action where a state would take control of another, taking over the government and ruling it as its own territory. Originally, the United States were 13 colonies of Great Britain. As a result, colonial powers laid claim to territories and created states with no regard for pre-existing cultural or ethnic boundaries. So basically, they didn't really care who was there before, and they would split up or combine groups that didn't get along. A lot of the problems that have continued to be fought over in the Middle East or parts of Africa came from colonial powers splitting these things up. And one of those major times was the Berlin Conference in the late 1800s. There were all these imperial powers in Europe that took over Africa and split up Africa into different colonies to each of the major powers. When they did this, they didn't think about any of the people's cultural ties there or any of the groups that lived there before. As you can see in this political cartoon, you can see Germany leading this European split up of Africa. And then the map below, right there, shows all of the territories that were ruled by European powers. So very few of the original African groups got to control their own countries. They were all colonies of the European powers. And so this kind of colonialism sets people back a very long time, because when you can't rule yourself, you can't make decisions that end up helping your country. There's also the Treaty of Versailles, which took place at the end of World War I. And that was another one where different parts of the world were broken up to the different powers. Imperialism stops happening shortly after this, from this time to the end of World War II, but still there are colonies being split up where people can't control their own independence. And so a lot of states were created out of those times without a lot of thought to who actually lived there, where they just drew lines on a map. We see after the World Wars, independence movements starting, where nations decide that they want to break off and form their own state. Now, obviously, there were a lot of historical ones we referenced yesterday before, like the Glorious Revolution in England, the American Revolution, the Haitian and Latin American revolutions that took place in the 17 and 1800s, and then the French Revolution being one of the bloodiest and most famous in world history. But a lot of independence movements start as the imperial powers of Europe start to fall as a result of World War I and then eventually at the end of World War II. There's still a lot of modern independence movements that happen, though. Catalonia tried to separate from Spain as recently as 2017. They thought they had the right to do that, and then when they tried to, the Spanish government decided that they did not and kept them as a part of the country of Spain. Scotland voted in 2014 to break off from the United Kingdom and be their own country again. It failed, so they are still part of the UK. And then Quebec has discussed leaving Canada. Remember we talked about that French-speaking part of Canada, that they're in the minority. They debated about splitting off and becoming their own country. So those are some modern movements for independence. And you can see in this political cartoon right here, the rest of Canada annoyed that the French keep asking to leave. When I say French, I mean French-speaking Catholic portion of Canada, not the French country. Another thing that defines modern political boundaries is devolution. Devolution is the movement of power from a central government to regional governments within a state. So where you have a much larger country that breaks down into smaller, or a national government that loses power to their local leadership. So it is the movement of power from the central government to regional governments within a state. An example of this is the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was a massive country that came after the Russian Revolution in the early 1900s. And the Soviet Union was formed of a lot of different cultural groups and ethnicities. When it fell, it broke into 15 different individual states. So 15 different countries. Russia being the biggest, Ukraine being one of them too. But you can see all of these different countries that split off from the Soviet Union. So that's devolution, where you go from one central power to more local regional powers. And here's a graphic to help you understand it. Devolution is the transfer of political power from central to sub-national government. You can see if the parliament in the UK lost power and went to Scottish parliament, that's an example of devolution. So that is it on today's lesson on political processes. That gives you a little bit of background on what took place to create the modern boundaries we have in the world today. We're going to go into more detail into those boundaries as we move through the unit. And that was just one more step in understanding our world. I'm Mr. Coulter, and that was Human Geography.